A man tears open his coat in the freezing cold, not to stay warm, but to give his warmth away to a dying child he's never met. She wasn't breathing. Her heart was almost gone. And then she opened her eyes, looked straight up at him, and said the one word he buried 4 years ago, along with his own daughter. What happens next will change everything for her, for him, and maybe even for you. This channel is where the Old West comes alive, stories of cowboys, rugged love, and the quiet, unbreakable bonds between mothers and children, strangers and souls, the lost and the ones who refuse to stop looking. Tonight's story reminds us that grief doesn't always break us sometimes. It's exactly what shapes us into the person someone else desperately needs. Tonight's story reminds us that grief doesn't always break us sometimes. It's exactly what shapes us into the person someone else desperately needs. If that opening gave you chills, wait until you hear the rest. Hit that like button, drop your town in the comments. Let's see how far this story rides tonight. And if stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe and bring someone along for the ride.
Because what Jesse is about to learn about these three little girls will shatter everything he believes about his family, his own brother, and the daughter he buried all those years ago. He figured she was already gone. That was the first thing that crossed Jesse's mind. The child in his arms was limp, not breathing, nothing. She was maybe 3 years old, her thin cotton dress frozen solid to skin that had gone beyond blue to something much worse, a lifeless gray. This winter, Jesse had seen cattle freeze solid right where they stood. He had seen a man's fingers turn black and snap clean off like dry twigs. It was January of 1887, out in the Wyoming Territory. People would come to call it the winter of the Great Die-Up. The winter that seemed determined to kill every living thing. But he'd be damned if he was going to let it take this child. He slapped her back, and he did it hard. Harder than a man ought to hit something so small. Still nothing. He gently turned her over, put his mouth to hers, and breathed his own air into her tiny lungs. Her small chest rose, then fell, and rose once more. Then came a cough, a weak and rattling sound. But it was real. "Papa," she whispered. Jesse's hands froze. His whole body went rigid. That one word, spoken exactly that way in that light, trusting voice. It was the same pitch, the very same way his Rosie used to say it when she'd run to him across the yard, her arms stretched out wide. "Papa, Papa, catch me!" Rosie had been gone for 4 years. A fever took her in just 3 days. Jesse had held her as she passed, felt her body go still, felt the weight of her change from life to gone. And now a stranger's child was speaking the word that had died with his own daughter. He had to put that thought away, not right now. He pushed the memory deep down, pulled the child tighter inside his coat and felt her heartbeat. It was weak, all wrong. But it was there. That's when a voice spoke up from behind him. "Mister, please don't hurt her." Jesse turned around. 2 more children were standing there in the snow. The older one was 9, maybe 10 years old, with reddish-brown hair matted with ice. Her blue-gray eyes looked like they belonged to someone 30 years older than the young face they were set in. She had planted her feet firmly between Jesse and the younger girl, her small fists clenched, looking ready to take on a man 3 times her size in a blizzard that would likely kill her within the hour. The other little girl stood behind her, about 6 years old, with blonde hair stuck flat to her head and huge, vacant brown eyes. She was clutching a piece of paper to her chest, all crumpled and dirty. She held on to it the way other children might hold a favorite doll. "I'm not aiming to hurt a soul," Jesse said. "This little one needs to get warm. Now, who are you two?" The older girl ignored his question and asked one of her own. "Is this the Hollowell Ranch?" Jesse stood a little straighter. "How do you know that name?" "Is it or isn't it?" she shot back. "It is." Then we're in the right place. The girl's voice trembled. She swayed a bit on her feet but caught her balance. We just need a place for one night, sir. Just one night and we'll be gone, I promise you. You're not going anywhere tonight. None of you are. Jesse nodded his head sharp-like toward the house. Smoke was billowing from the chimney, the only sign of warmth in a frozen world. Get moving now, before this storm decides to take us all. The older girl took the younger one's hand, and they followed him. The little one never made a sound, not a cry, not a word, just those empty brown eyes staring off at nothing. Jesse kicked the front door open, and a wave of heat washed over them. Lola came out from the kitchen. She was 58 years old with her gray hair tied back and had worked on this ranch for 20 years. She was there when Rosie was born. She was there when they buried her. When she saw the baby, she crossed herself. Dios mío, how long has she been like this? I don't know. Found them out by the fence line. Jesse carefully laid the little one, Birdie, on the rug near the fireplace. She's burning with fever, a bad one. Lola's hands were already at work, taking off the wet clothes and wrapping her in warm blankets. She put her palm on Birdie's forehead, and a worried look came over her face. This feels like 103 degrees at least, maybe even higher. She looked straight at Jesse. I need hot water, some chamomile, and every last blanket in this house. Now go. Jesse hurried to the kitchen, pumped water from the well, and set the pot on the stove. His hands were trembling, but not from the cold. The older girl had followed him. She stood right in the kitchen doorway, just watching him, sizing him up, taking note of every door, every window, and anything she could grab to use as a weapon. Jesse knew that look well. He'd seen it in wild mustangs right before they decided to either break or try to kill you. Sit down, he said. There's stew on the stove and bread in the box. Feed yourself and your sister. The girl didn't sit. She served the younger one first, setting a bowl in front of her and watching until she started to eat. Only after that did she get a bowl for herself, and the whole time she ate, her eyes never once left Jesse. What's your name? Jesse asked. Eliza May Coulton. She gestured toward the younger girl. That there is Hannah. She doesn't talk. Is she sick too? No, sir. Eliza's voice turned hard as stone. She just quit talking. Happened about 4 months ago. Jesse looked over at Hannah. The 6-year-old was eating her stew with just one hand. Her other hand was still pressing that crumpled piece of paper against her chest. She hadn't let go of it for a second. Not while she was trudging through the snow, not when she sat down, and not now. What happened 4 months ago? Jesse asked her. Eliza's spoon froze midway to her mouth. She put it back down in the bowl and looked at Jesse with those old, weary eyes. Our uncle happened. From the front room, Lola called out, Mr. Hollowell, you need to come here right now. There was an urgency in her voice that sent a chill down Jesse's spine. He'd heard that tone from her only once before, 4 years ago, when Lola was getting Rosie ready for a fever bath and discovered the rash that confirmed it was scarlet fever. He walked back into the front room. Lola had pulled the blanket off of Birdie. The baby's little arms were exposed. Jesse saw the bruises, some old and faded to yellow and green, all shaped like fingerprints. They were on both her arms and along her ribs. Somebody had grabbed this child, squeezed her hard, and shaken her, and not just one time. His jaw tightened. I've seen marks like these before, Lola said softly. My sister back in Guadalajara. Her husband used to do the same thing, grab her when he got drunk, shake her when she cried. She paused for a moment. My sister didn't make it, Mr. Hollowell. She was only 19. Jesse stood up and walked back to the kitchen. Eliza was watching him. She knew exactly what he had just seen, like she had been waiting for him to see it. Your uncle did that to Birdie? He wasn't asking. Eliza didn't take it as a question. Yes, sir. To all of you? Eliza simply pulled up her sleeve. He saw faded bruises, marks from a belt, and one round scar from a deliberate, Burn, probably from a lit cigar. Jesse felt a white-hot rage swell up in his chest like a physical blow. It was the old anger, his father's anger, the same fury that ran in his blood and just waited for moments like this one. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and forced the rage back down into the place where he kept it locked away. "Who is your uncle?" "Edgar Prescott." The name hit the air like a stone dropping in a quiet pond. Edgar Prescott, the banker over at Elkhorn Creek, the same man who sat right in the front pew at church every Sunday. He held the notes on half the businesses in town, shook your hand like a preacher, and smiled like a man who'd never done a single thing wrong in his life. "How long have you been living with him?" "6 months. Ever since Papa died back in June." Jessie pulled out a chair and sat down right across from her. "So how did you end up at my front gate, in the middle of a blizzard, 50 miles from town?" Eliza looked over at Hannah. The little girl wasn't eating anymore. She had put her spoon down and was carefully unfolding the crumpled paper on the table. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing, made with charcoal on a piece of brown wrapping paper. It showed a house with a man standing in the doorway. He was holding something in his hand, a belt, and over in a corner were 3 small figures all huddled together. Jesse stared at the drawing, and a knot formed in his throat. "Hannah drew that last week," Eliza explained. "She draws all the things she can't say out loud. She's got 40 more just like it in her coat." Jesse looked at Hannah. The 6-year-old was now adding something new to the drawing. It was a 4th figure, bigger than the others, standing right between the man and the 3, small shapes shielding them. She had given this new figure a hat, a cowboy hat. Jesse had to look away. He turned his eyes back to Eliza. "How did you find me?" "Papa told me to, right before he died. He gave me a letter. He said if anything bad ever happened, if Uncle Edgar ever hurt us, I was supposed to find you." She took a breath. "He said that you were his brother." The kitchen fell into a quiet so deep you could almost hear the snow falling outside. The wood in the stove popped. The wind howled against the house. But inside, not a thing moved. Jesse's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened again. But no words came out. "Samuel." Eliza just nodded. "Samuel Colton, Samuel Prescott, Samuel, whatever name he was using." It was Jesse's younger brother. The one who had just up and left 18 years ago changed his name and vanished completely. He never sent a single letter, never made any contact. Jesse had cut him out of his life like a branch cut off the family tree. He hadn't even said that name in years, had taught himself not to even think it. Samuel was gone, and had been gone long before he died, and even more so after. And now, here were his daughters, sitting in Jesse's own kitchen, eating Jesse's stew, and carrying Jesse's family name in a letter written by a dead man. "Your father," Jesse said, his voice slow and measured. "He told you about me?" "He talked about you all the time." Eliza's voice softened. "He told us about when you two were boys, about this ranch, and about how you always protected him from your daddy when he got mean." She paused. "Papa said you were the best man he ever knew. He said if anything ever happened to him, you were the only person in the whole world he would trust to look after us." Jesse stood up and walked over to the window, pressing his forehead against the freezing glass. The reflection that looked back at him was worn thin, scraped out from the inside. It was the face of a man who had not had a decent night's sleep in 4 years. Samuel had trusted him. Samuel, the one who left without a single word, who did not show up for Catherine's funeral, who did not even send flowers when little Rosie passed. After all that, Samuel still trusted him. Why did he not come to me himself? Why send you? "Because he's gone, Mr. Hollowell. I know he is gone. What I mean is, before all this, why did he not come back in 18 years? Why not even one time?" Eliza stayed quiet for a long spell. Then she said something that hit Jesse harder than anything else that night. He wrote you 3 different times. You never did write him back. Jesse spun around. I never received any letters. Eliza just stared at him. Something in her eyes changed. It was fear, not fear of Jesse. Fear of something else. Something she was piecing together in her own mind. Papa said the same thing. He said, maybe you just burned them. But then he said, or maybe someone made sure they never got to you. Someone who did not want the 2 of you talking. Edgar. Eliza did not give an answer, but her face said it all. The clock on the wall kept on ticking. Outside, the storm was slamming against the windows. From the front room, Bertie coughed. It was a small, wet sound that was all wrong. Lola showed up in the kitchen doorway. The baby's fever has come down a bit. I reckon she will make it through the night. But Mr. Hollowell, she hesitated. That little one has not been fed right in weeks. You can count her ribs. You can count all their ribs. Jesse just nodded. Get the guest. Room ready. All 3 of them together. You hear? Lola glanced at Eliza. Come on now, mija. You bring your sister. Y'all are safe in this house tonight. Eliza got to her feet and took Hannah's hand. Hannah took her drawing, folded it up real careful, and clutched it tight to her chest. They trailed Lola down the hallway. At the door, Eliza paused and looked back. Mr. Hollowell. Yeah. Uncle Edgar will come looking for us. He always does. He tracked us down in Cheyenne in just 2 days. Found us in Laramie in 3. She stopped for a breath. He has got the town marshal in his back pocket. He has got the judge there, too. He will show up here, and he will be holding papers, and he will have a big smile on his face, and every single person will believe him because that is just what he does. He makes folks believe him. Jessie looked her square in the eyes. Well, let him come. You do not get it. Eliza's voice got real low. The last family that tried to help us out, the Hendersons back in Cheyenne. She took another breath. Their barn burned to the ground a week after we were gone. Their horses were still inside. Jesse felt a deep chill sink right into his bones. It was not from the storm outside, but from the hard truth this little girl was telling him. I am not the Hendersons, Eliza. No, sir, you are not. And that is what has me so scared. Because Papa said you were stubborn enough to put up a fight, and the folks who fight Edgar are always the ones who end up hurt the worst. She turned then and vanished down the hall. Jesse heard the guest room door click shut. He heard Lola's voice, soft and kind, the rustle of blankets being straightened out, of children finding a place in a bed that was not their own, but was warm and dry and safe for now. Jesse sat by himself in the kitchen, the coffee in his hand turning cold. He thought about Samuel, about the boy who used to trail him around the ranch like a puppy, who would crawl into Jesse's bed when the thunder rolled, the boy Jesse had protected from their father's angry fists 100 times, maybe 1,000. He thought about the very last time he laid eyes on his brother. It was a Tuesday morning. Samuel was 20 years old, standing by the gate with a pack slung over his shoulder. Jesse was 27, watching from the porch, too full of pride to ask him to stay, too filled with anger to say a proper goodbye. Samuel had looked back one time, just that once, before he turned and walked on down the road. 18 years. No letters ever made it to him, no visits, not a single word at all, until these 3 little children appeared in the middle of a blizzard, holding his name like it was some kind of prayer. Sometime around midnight, Jesse went to check on them. He just could not stop himself. He eased the guest room door open, slow and quiet. The fire in the hearth was just glowing embers. Bertie was laying right in the middle of the big bed. Hannah was curled up beside her, looking protective even while she was asleep. And Eliza, well, Eliza was not asleep at all. She was sitting straight up, her back against the headboard, watching the door. The moment Jessie appeared, her hand slipped under the pillow. It came back holding a kitchen knife she must have grabbed from the table. Easy now, Jessie said softly. It is only me. Eliza lowered the knife a little, but she did not put it away. Do you need something? Just came to check on Birdie. She is breathing easier. Her fever is down some. Good. Jesse leaned his shoulder against the door. You do this every single night, don't you? You just sit there and keep watch. Someone's got to. Her words were plain, but they hit him like a ton of bricks. 9 years old, and she'd appointed herself the guardian, the one who stared into the darkness so her sisters could sleep soundly. Jessie just looked at this little girl who wore her tiredness like a heavy winter coat. You can get some sleep tonight, Eliza. I will take the watch. You do not have to do that. I know I do not, but I want to. Jessie waited a moment. When was the last time you really slept? I mean, deep down sleep, not that kind where you are just waiting for a floorboard to creak. Eliza got real quiet. Then she said, I do not rightly remember. Jessie grabbed a chair from the corner, put it right by the door, and sat himself down. Go on now, get to sleep, Eliza. She just stared at him, that little knife still clutched in her hand. For 30 long seconds, maybe a whole minute, he watched her. Then, it was like something she had been holding together with nothing but grit for 6 long months, finally broke. Her little chin started to tremble. She bit down hard on her lip to stop it. If I go to sleep, she said, if I really close my eyes, you will still be sitting here when I wake up. I will be right here. I ain't going nowhere. Eliza looked at him for one more long moment. Then she slid the knife under her pillow, laid down, and pulled her sisters in close. She was asleep in less than 2 minutes, like her body had just been waiting for someone to give it permission. Like all she ever needed was for one person to say, I will keep watch, so you do not have to. Jessie sat in that chair by the door, and he listened to them breathe. 3 little girls, his brother's girls, sent to him by way of a blizzard, a letter from a dead man and 6 months of running scared. His mind turned to Edgar Prescott, to barns that burn in the middle of the night, to judges bought and paid for, to a man who could hurt a 3-year-old and then show up smiling in church on Sunday. He thought about that letter tucked away in Eliza's boot, the one from Samuel, the one that was meant for him. It held the answers to questions Jessie did not even know how to ask yet. He thought about his Rosie, about how she used to sleep just like Birdie was sleeping now, with her fist all balled up in the blanket, her mouth open just a little bit, making that tiny breathing sound that told you everything in the world was all right. Jessie pressed the palms of his hands against his eyes and held them there until the burning finally stopped. Over in the bed, Birdie stirred, sick, and she had just reached out for the closest solid thing she could find and held on for dear life. And Jessie, Lord help him, he let her. That storm howled and threw a fit all night long, but the house stood strong. 3 little girls slept the soundest sleep they had probably had in 6 months. And in that chair by the door, a man who had sworn up and down he would never love another living thing again sat there and watched them breathe. And he felt the ice way down deep in his chest crack just a little for the first time since he buried his own daughter in the hard-packed dirt behind the barn. He did not sleep. He did not even try. He just watched, and he waited. And he wondered what in the world Samuel had written in that letter that was so important. It was worth sending 3 children through a blizzard just to deliver it. The morning would come soon enough. The letter would have to be read. The truth of it all would land heavy like a hammer. But that was for the morning, the power. This was right now, and right now 3 little girls were safe and they were warm and they were sleeping. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything Jesse Hollowell had not even known he needed until it stumbled half dead onto his porch and called him Papa. Morning finally broke, all gray and cold. The storm was over, but the sky had not cleared up. It just hung there, low and heavy, like it was still thinking about whether to hit them again. Jesse had not budged from that chair. His back was aching, something fierce. His neck was stiff as a board. His legs had gone numb sometime around 4 in the morning, but Birdie's little hand was still wrapped around his knee, and he just did not have the heart to move it. Eliza woke up first, her eyes just snapping open all at once. There was no slow drift between sleeping and being awake for her. She saw Jessie there in the chair. She saw his hand resting beside Bird's head. She noticed he was still there. Something in her expression changed. It was not yet trust, but it was a place where trust could grow. "You did not leave," she said. "I told you I would not." Eliza sat up and glanced at her sisters. Hannah was still sound asleep, curled into a tight ball with the drawing held fast to her chest, safe even in her dreams. Bird was breathing more easily, more deeply. The color had returned to her face, changing from a sickly gray to a healthier pink. Her fever finally broke around 3 in the morning, Jessie informed her. Lola checked on her twice during the night. Eliza gave a slow nod, swung her legs over the side of the bed, and stood. She was still in the dry clothes Lola had found for her. They were much too big. The sleeves fell far past her hands. She looked like a small child playing dress-up. "Mr. Hollowell." "Yes, the letter. The one from my papa." She paused for a moment. "You did not search my things while I slept." "No, ma'am. That is for you to give me when you decide the time is right." Eliza studied his face. Then she bent over, pulled off her boot, reached deep inside and retrieved a folded sheet of paper. It was worn soft and thin from 6 months of being carried, 6 months of being hidden, 6 months of running for their lives. She held it out to him. "I am ready now." Jessie took it. The paper felt like old cloth. His brother's handwriting was on the outside, just 2 simple words, "For Jessie." He unfolded it. It read, "Jessie, if you are reading this, it means I am dead and my girls have made it to you. It means Eliza did as I instructed. She is courageous, more courageous than we ever were. Take care of all 3 of them, brother. Birdie is small, but she is a fighter." Hannah stopped speaking after the things Edgar did. "Do not try to make her talk. She will speak again when she feels safe. Eliza carries the weight of it all. She will tell you she is fine. She is not fine. She has not been since her mother died 2 years ago. Do not let her trick you. Now here is the hardest part. Edgar Prescott is not related to us. He is a business associate in a mining operation out of British Columbia. I was at that mine back in 1879. I saw a man get killed. The foreman, Jacob Dunning, concealed what happened. I tried to go to the authorities. They came for me. I ran, I changed my name, I hid my family, but they still found me. Jessie, Edgar is the one who found me. He severed the brake cable on my wagon. He made it all look like an accident. I know this because I saw the cuts myself before I took that wagon down the road. I drove it on purpose to lead them away from my daughters. There is proof of everything, all of it. Papers, photographs, names, dates. I have hidden it all in the well at our old homestead just outside Elhorn Creek. It is the stone well. It is behind the 3rd stone down from the water level on the north side. Get it, Jessie. Use that proof. Ruin Edgar Prescott and every last man on his payroll. And brother, I am so sorry. I am sorry that I left. I am sorry that I stayed away. I am sorry that my pride was too big to let me come home. You deserved more than my silence. The girls deserve more than my mistakes. Give them the things I could not. A home, a family, someone who will stay. Your brother, Samuel." Jessie read the letter a second time, then a third. He folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, flat against his chest, right next to the heartbeat that was pounding so hard he felt it in his ears. Eliza was watching his every move. "You already knew," he said, "about the mine and about Edgar. Papa told me some of it, not all of it. Just enough so I knew Uncle Edgar was a dangerous man and that if something happened to Papa, I had to run. You ran on 2 other occasions. Cheyenne, Laramie. He caught us both times." Eliza's voice was completely steady, but her hands were trembling. "This time I waited. I waited for him to go to Helena on some bank business. I took money from his desk and bought train tickets for the next town over. Then we walked, in the middle of January, through a blizzard with a 3-year-old. I did not plan for the blizzard, Mr. Hollowell. I only planned to run. God was the one who planned the weather." Jessie almost smiled at that. Almost. "How much is Hannah aware of?" "Hannah knows everything. She just cannot find the words for it. Eliza looked at her sleeping sister. She saw things happen at Uncle Edgar's house. Things she draws pictures of instead of talking about. She has drawings of all of it. Every time he would hit us, every time he locked us down in the cellar, every time he... Eliza stopped, her jaw working. She swallowed with great effort. Every single time. Jesse's hands balled into fists on his knees. What other things did he do? Eliza just shook her head. Not now. Not with them in the room. The unspoken words hung in the space between them. They were heavy. They were ugly. They were full of things a 9-year-old girl should never be forced to carry. Lola appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with coffee, oatmeal, and biscuits. She set it on the table, her eyes moving from Eliza to Jesse. The little one needs to eat in small amounts. Warm broth, if you have any. We have it, Jesse said. He stood up, his knees cracking loudly, his body reminding him that he was 39 years old and had been sitting in a wooden chair for 8 hours. He walked into the kitchen. Lola was right behind him. You read his letter, she said. It was not a question. I read it. And with that, Jesse poured coffee, drank it down black, and burned his tongue without even noticing. Samuel was murdered. Edgar Prescott is the man who killed him, and there is proof of it hidden in a well at the old place. Lola made the sign of the cross on her chest. And the girls, they will be staying here. Mr. Hollowell. Lola's voice was measured. You are aware of what the people in town will say. A single man taking in 3 little girls with no wife and no female family. In a town like this, the talk will start before the snow is even gone. Let it start. I'm not worried about the talk. I am worried about what Edgar will do with it. A man like him, he will use it against you. He will say you're unfit. He will say the girls are not safe. He will bring the law into it. Then I will deal with the law. Lola gave him a hard stare, the same look she used to give him when he was drinking too much after Rosie died. You cannot deal with the law by being stubborn, Mr. Hollowell. You deal with it by being smart. You need a lawyer. You need to get that proof from the well. You need to get folks on your side before Edgar shows up because he is coming. The girl was right about that much. He will come, and he will put on a smile, and half this town will believe every single word that comes out of his mouth. Jesse set his cup down. You are right. I know I am right. I have been right about most things for the last 20 years. You just do not always decide to listen. Jesse looked at her. This woman had raised him just as much as his own mother. She had helped him bury his wife. She had washed Rosie's body for the funeral when Jesse's hands were shaking too much for him to do it himself. Thank you, Lola, for last night, for everything. Lola just waved a hand at him. Do not thank me. Feed those children. That is all the thanks I need. The day moved by, strange and slow. Bird's fever stayed at 101. That was not good, but it was not a dying fever. She mostly slept, waking up just long enough to eat the broth that Lola spooned between her lips, with all the patience of a woman who had fed many sick children before. Hannah sat by the fire the whole morning, not saying a word, just drawing. She had taken a piece of charcoal out of her coat pocket and was using the back of an old feed bill from Jesse's desk. She drew without a single pause, never looking up, as if the images were just pouring out of her, and she had no way to stop them. Jesse watched her from across the room. He could not see her drawings, and he was not sure if he wanted to. Eliza worked without needing to be asked or told. She swept the kitchen floor, stacked the firewood, and helped Lola knead bread. Her hands moved with a skill that showed she had been doing these chores for years. She works like a grown woman, Lola said in a low voice to Jesse as they watched from the hall. Who taught her all that? She taught herself, Jesse said. She had to. Around noon, Jesse got up to put on his coat. Where are you going? Eliza asked. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, her hands covered in flour, her eyes sharp and questioning. Into town. I have to see someone. Who? Father O'Brien at the church. And I have to send a telegram to a lawyer I know in Cheyenne. Eliza's face grew tight. You are going to fight him. You are going to fight Edgar. I am going to do what your father asked me to, which is to protect you. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Hollowell, the last time somebody tried to help us, she stopped talking. I know, the Hendersons. Their barn was burned down. Jesse pulled on his gloves. I am not the Hendersons, Eliza. I have been running this ranch on this land for 20 years. I know every man in this territory, and I do not frighten easily. Eliza just looked at him, wanting so much to believe him, but too afraid to. Come back, she said, her voice small. Please. I will be back before it gets dark. I promise you. He rode into Elkhorn Creek under a sky that could not make up its mind between snowing and sunshine. The town was small, just one main street with a general store, a saloon, the bank, the church, and a courthouse. Maybe 300 people lived there in a good year. Father Patrick O'Brien was in the rectory. He was 62 years old with white hair and kind eyes, the sort of priest who spent more time listening than he did preaching. Jesse told him the whole story. The girls, the letter, the bruises on their bodies. Edgar. O'Brien sat in silence for a long time after Jesse finished. His hands were folded, and his eyes were on the cross that hung above the door. You believe the child? He asked. I believe the bruises I saw on a 3-year-old's arms. I believe the marks left by a belt on a 9-year-old's back. I believe that cigar burns do not just happen by accident. And as for the murder in the mine, that is what the proof in that well is for. But first, there is something I have to know, Father. Is Edgar Prescott connected to anyone important in this town? Anyone with power? O'Brien's expression changed, turning cautious. Edgar holds the banknotes on the general store and the livery stable. He has been making donations to the church for 10 years. He and Marshal Dunning are very close, very close. And Judge Whitaker over in Cheyenne, the man who presides over all the custody cases. O'Brien paused. I have heard things, nothing I can prove, mind you. But the talk is that Whitaker and Edgar have an understanding. What kind of understanding? The kind where the judge makes rulings that benefit the banker, and in return, the banker makes sure the judge's gambling debts just disappear. Jesse felt that cold feeling again. It was the same one from the night before. It was not from the weather. It was something much worse. So if Edgar files for custody and I choose to fight it, the judge has already been bought and paid for. That is what I am telling you. O'Brien leaned forward. Jesse, I am on your side in this. God knows those children need someone to protect them. But you need to understand what you are up against. Edgar Prescott is not just some fella. He is the whole works. He has the lawmen, he has the money, he has got all the right people in his corner. You have got a ranch and a good heart. And in my time, I have seen a good heart get beat by a crooked game 9 times out of 10. Then I reckon I will be the 10th time. O'Brien sized him up, then gave a sad little smile. Your brother was just the same, stubborn right down to the bone. You knew Samuel? He came to see me once, years back before he passed. He sat right there in that chair you are in, told me he had done something that could not be forgiven, and asked me if God could find a way to love him still. What did you tell him? I told him that God's love was never the question. The question was whether he could ever love himself enough to ask for a helping hand. Did he ask? No. O'Brien's voice got real quiet. He just left, and 6 months later he was gone. Do not you make the same mistake, Jesse. Do not you try to carry this load all by yourself. Jesse rode back to the ranch while the sun bled out across the sky. It painted the white snow with orange light. It was beautiful. He never even noticed. He found Eliza waiting on the porch. She shot to her feet the second she saw him, her body drawn tight as a wire, until she was sure it was him and not somebody else. You came back, she said. I told you I would. Inside, the house was warm. Birdie was awake, sitting in Lola's lap near the fireplace. She had color in her cheeks and her eyes were brighter. She was still sick, but she was a fighter. When Jessie came through the door, Birdie looked right at him and stretched her little arms out. "Papa." "Up." Jessie glanced at Lola. Lola just shrugged her shoulders. The little one knows what she wants. Jessie scooped Birdie up. She did not weigh a thing. She laid her head on his shoulder, balled her little fist in his shirt collar, and let out a sigh. It was the sigh of a child who had finally found what she was looking for and had no intention of ever letting go. A lump formed in Jessie's throat. He just held her, did not say a word, could not find any. Eliza watched him from the doorway, and you could not read a thing on her face. Later that night, long after the girls were put to bed, Jessie was sitting in his study. The letter was on the desk, the fire was burning down to coals, and a glass of whiskey sat there untouched. He heard a soft knock. Jessie looked up. Hannah was standing in the doorway. It was the first time she had ever come to him by herself. It was the first time she had gone anywhere without Eliza. She was holding a sheet of paper. She walked right up to his desk, placed it down in front of him, and looked him straight in the eyes. Then she turned around and left without a single word. Jessie looked down at the drawing. This one was different from all her others. There was no man with a belt, no kids huddled in a corner. This one showed a house with snow on its roof and smoke curling from the chimney. And there in the window were 4 figures, 3 small ones and 1 tall one. The tall one was holding the littlest one, and they were all together, all safe, all inside, where the cold could not get to them. At the very bottom, in shaky, childish letters, Hannah had written 2 words. Our house. Jessie just stared at it until the fire died completely, until the whiskey turned warm, until the tears he refused to cry came all the same, falling on the paper and smudging the charcoal just a little bit. He wiped at his eyes, folded that drawing real careful, and put it in his pocket right next to the letter from Samuel. It was 2 pieces of paper. One was from a brother, now gone, telling him to fight. The other was from a quiet little girl asking him to stay. He was going to do both. The next morning, Jessie was up before the sun. He got dressed and found Lola in the kitchen. "I need you to watch the girls for me today. I am riding out to the old homestead, out to the well." Lola set her coffee cup down. "You are going to get the proof. I am going to get whatever Samuel hid there. If Edgar shows up while I am gone, he will not come today. It is too soon. A man like Edgar, he makes plans. He does not get in a hurry. How can you be so sure?" "Because I grew up around men just like Edgar, Mr. Hollowell. They are all cut from the same cloth. They take their sweet time. They build their whole story. They make sure nobody is paying attention before they make their move." She paused for a moment. "You have got a week, 2 at the most. You had better use it." Jessie nodded and walked over to the guest room. Eliza was already up, dressed, and braiding Hannah's hair. "I am riding out today," Jessie said. "I will be back before nightfall." "The homestead?" "Yeah." Eliza's hands froze in the middle of a braid. "Be careful. Papa told me he set traps all around the well to keep folks away." "What kind of traps?" "The kind that hurt." Jessie knelt down to her level and looked at her. "Is there anything else I need to know?" Eliza thought about it. Then she said, "The 3rd stone from the water line, on the north side. Papa said you have to pull it straight out. Do not twist it, or the whole box will fall down into the water and the papers will be ruined. He was a smart man, your father." "He was." Eliza's voice cracked, just enough to show the sorrow she kept locked up behind all that toughness. "He was the smartest man I ever knew. And it was not enough to save him." Jessie put his hand on her shoulder and left it there for 3 seconds. Then he stood up. "I will be back before dark. You keep saying that because I keep meaning it." He walked out, swung up on his horse, and rode toward the old Colulton place. 4 hours to the west. The sky was finally clearing up, the first patch of blue in days. It was cold enough to freeze your spit before it even hit the ground. But at least that wind had died down. He rode and thought about Edgar Prescott, about crooked judges and lawmen on the payroll. He thought about a whole system set up to protect rich men and grind everybody else into the dirt. He thought about Samuel, about the little boy who used to follow him everywhere, about the man who drove a busted wagon down a mountain road because he knew it was the only way to lead trouble away from his children. He thought about Rosie and how he had failed her, how that fever came on, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And all his strength and all his land and all his money did not mean a thing, because his little girl was dead, and he could not fix it. He thought about Bertie, about the way she said Papa, about the way she curled her little fist in his collar like she was holding on to the very edge of the world. He thought about Hannah, a 6-year-old girl who just stopped talking because words had gotten dangerous, who drew pictures instead, because a picture could tell the truth without getting you hurt. He thought about Eliza, just 9 years old, carrying the weight of everything, sleeping with a knife under her pillow, and protecting her sisters with a fire that would make most grown men back down. 3 little girls, his brother's daughters, sent to him in the middle of a blizzard, with a letter from a dead man, 6 months' worth of bruises, and one last desperate hope that he would be the man Samuel thought he was. Jesse tightened his grip on the reins, set his jaw, and spurred his horse on faster. He was going to get that proof. He was going to burn Edgar Prescott's whole world to the ground. And he was going to give those girls the one thing that nobody had ever given them. A home. A real one. The kind of place where nobody ever hit you, or burned you, or locked you up in the dark. The kind of place where you could sleep without a knife, and draw pictures without being afraid, and say Papa to a man who would sooner die than let anyone ever hurt you again. The homestead finally came into view on the horizon. There were burned timbers, scorched earth, and right in the middle of all that ruin, standing there untouched, was the stone well. Jesse swung down from his horse and walked toward it. It was his brother's grave, and his brother's last gift, both waiting for him in the very same spot. He started to climb down. The rope bit into his palms on the way down. It was 20 feet of pure darkness, and the temperature dropped with every foot he went down. By the time Jesse's boots splashed into the water, his teeth were chattering and his fingers were starting to go numb. It was knee-deep and freezing. It was the kind of cold that seeps right into your bones and just squeezes. He struck a match. The little flame lit up the circular stone walls. The water was as black as ink. He could see his own breath puffing out in white clouds. The third stone from the waterline, north side. Do not twist it. Jesse found the stone. It looked newer than the ones around it. The mortar was fresher. He took out his knife and worked the blade into the crack. He was careful and steady, like when you are pulling a calf that is born wrong. Just enough force to get it to move, but not enough to break anything. The stone popped free. Behind it sat a metal box sealed up with wax. It was waterproof and heavier than it looked. Jesse grabbed it, shoved it inside his coat, and started climbing. Halfway to the top, his boot slipped on the slick stone. The rope jerked, his shoulder twisted hard, and he swung right into the wall. The stone dug into his ribs. He held on tight, kept climbing, and did not stop until that blue sky hit his face and the cold air, which felt warm compared to that well, filled up his lungs. He sat on the frozen ground, just trying to catch his breath. The box was in his lap. It was his brother's last secret. He broke the wax seal and opened it up. Inside, wrapped up in oilcloth, were papers, photographs, and a leather-bound journal, and pressed between the pages were dried wildflowers, purple and yellow, the kind that grew up in the high meadows during the summer, the kind Catherine used to pick before she died. Jesse's hands started to shake. He opened the journal first. It was Samuel's handwriting, page after page of it. There were dates, names, and details about every single death at the Whitefish mine, all written down with the care of a man who knew he was building a case that could get him killed. 12 men had died between 1877 and 1883. Every one of them was ruled an accident, and everyone was signed off on by the mine foreman, a man named Jacob Dunning. Jesse stopped breathing. He read that name again. Jacob Dunning. He was Marshal Wade Dunning's brother, the same Marshal of Elorn Creek, the man who wore a badge and kept the peace, the man who was supposed to be protecting people like Eliza and Hannah and Birdie. His brother was the one who had covered up 12 murders. Jesse kept on reading. The mine was owned by a front company called Western Range Holdings. Samuel had managed to trace the real owners through the territorial records. There were 3 names: Jacob Dunning, Edgar Prescott, and Judge Arthur Whitaker, the same judge who handled custody cases, the same Judge O'Brien had said was in Edgar's pocket. He was not in his pocket, he was his partner. He was a co-owner, a man who would decide if Jesse got to keep the girls. And that man had helped kill their father. Jesse shut the journal, put everything back into the box, and sealed it up again. He rode back hard. The 4 hours felt like 40. With every mile he rode, the weight of what he was carrying got heavier. It was not the box. It was the knowledge, the full understanding of what he was really up against. It was not just one man, it was a system, a whole rotten machine. From the kind of money and law that would smile right at you during the Sunday service. He got back to the ranch just as the sun was setting. Lola was waiting on the porch with her arms crossed, a worried look etched on her face. "Something has happened," she said, even before he could swing a leg over his horse. "What is it?" "Marshal Dunning stopped by a couple of hours ago. He had official papers." A chill went straight through Jesse. What sort of papers? A welfare check. It was just like the letter said. Edgar Prescott went and filed a complaint. He is claiming that 3 underage children are missing from his care, and he has good reason to think they are right here. Lola's voice was firm, but her eyes gave away her fear. The marshal spoke with Eliza. Jesse was already off his horse before Lola could finish her sentence. "Where is she?" "In the kitchen. She is all right. She took care of it." Lola took a breath. "She handled it better than I could have. Better than most grown women I know would have." Jesse went inside and found Eliza sitting at the kitchen table with Hannah drawing pictures beside her. Birdie was propped up in a chair, wrapped in blankets, wide awake and eating little pieces of bread Lola had torn for her. Eliza looked up as Jesse came in. Her face was pale, but her gaze was solid as a rock. "The marshal asked me some questions," she told him. "I said what he needed to hear." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him we are here because this is where we want to be. I said that Uncle Edgar gets mean sometimes. I told him we do not want to go back there." She paused for a moment. "He wrote everything down. Then he told me, 'Your Uncle Edgar has filed for a formal custody hearing. Judge Whitaker is coming down from Cheyenne in 6 weeks to make a decision.'" 6 weeks. February 28th. Eliza's voice was steady as a stone. The marshal said, "You will need to establish some legal right to be here by then, or the judge will hand you all right back over to Edgar." Jesse sat down on the other side of the table from her. He placed the box down between them. Eliza just stared at it. "You found it. I found it. And Eliza, it is much worse than what your father wrote. The mine, all the men who died. Edgar is not just some guardian who laid a hand on you. He is tied up in something much bigger. The marshal's own brother was the one running that mine. The judge who is going to decide your fate is one of Edgar's business partners. They are all in it together." Eliza did not even flinch. She did not cry. She just nodded her head, like she was hearing news she had been expecting her whole life. "Papa always said it went up high. He said the law in this town was for sale. That is the reason he ran instead of trying to report it." She looked down at the box. "Is there enough in there to stop them? Enough to prove what really happened at the mine?" "There is enough to prove Edgar was behind your father's death. But none of that will matter a bit if the judge listening to it is the same man getting rich from the mine. So what are we going to do? We have to go around the judge. We have to go clean over his head. We need to take this to people who cannot be bought." "Who?" Jesse thought of Father O'Brien and the church records, and the one place in this whole territory that Edgar did not own. "I need some time to think on it. But first, there is something I have to ask you, and I'm going to need the whole truth, all of it." Eliza looked him straight in the eye. Ask, your father's letter mentioned that Hannah quit talking because of something Edgar did. What exactly did he do to her? Eliza's jaw tightened. She glanced over at Hannah. The 6-year-old was deep in her drawing, not paying them any mind. Or maybe she was hearing every single word but just could not answer. He locked her down in the root cellar, Eliza said, for 3 days with no food and no light. She was screaming for most of the first day and crying through the second. By the time the 3rd day came, she had gone quiet. She has not said a word since then. Jesse felt that old anger start to boil up inside him. It was a familiar heat, a wildfire passed down from his father, the kind of rage that lived in his bones and just waited for moments like this to show its teeth. He shut his eyes and took 1 deep breath, then 2, then 3. When he opened them again, Eliza was watching him, studying him with those sharp eyes of hers, looking for any sign of danger. You are angry, she stated. Yes. Are you going to hit something? No. Papa used to get angry like that. You could see it all over his face when he did, but he never laid a hand on us. Not one time. She paused. Is that what your father did? Did he hit people when he got angry? Jesse just looked at this 9-year-old girl who saw right through everything and understood more than most grown folks. Yes, that is exactly what he did. And you are afraid you will become just like him. Every single day of my life. Eliza nodded as if that answer made sense to her, like it was the only answer, the truthful one. Papa used to say the same thing. He would say, your grandfather was a cruel man, and both of us have spent our entire lives trying not to be him. She reached her small hand across the table and laid it on the box. Papa won that fight. He never hit anybody. He never turned into his father. She looked right at Jesse. You can win too. Jesse just stared at this child. This unbelievably brave, impossibly smart, impossibly broken child, who had trekked through a blizzard with her 2 sisters and a letter from a dead man, and still had enough strength left in her to soothe the grown man's own demons. How old are you? He finally asked. 9? You talk like you are 90. That is just what happens when you have to grow up too fast, Mr. Hollowell. You miss out on all the parts in the middle. The next 2 weeks went by in a blur. Jesse got word to a lawyer over in Cheyenne. He was a young man named David Hart, fresh out of law school and hungry for a case that actually meant something. Hart showed up on a Tuesday, read through the papers from the well, and almost fell right out of his chair. This is enough to bring the whole thing down, the mine, the judge, and the marshal, Hart said. This is pure dynamite. Can you use it in a custody hearing? Hart just shook his head. Not in a direct way. A custody hearing is about what is best for the children, not about bringing up criminal charges. But if we can expose the judge's conflict of interest, get him taken off the case, and get a fair judge to take his place, then yes, Edgar will lose everything. How do we get the judge removed? We are going to need someone with real authority to challenge him. A federal marshal, or someone from the territorial governor's office. We need somebody that Edgar cannot get his hands on. Jesse thought about it for a minute, thinking about who he knew, who might owe him a favor, and who had enough pull to fight a crooked system and enough grit to actually see it through. Clara Whitfield, he said. Hart looked puzzled. Who? Clara June Whitfield, the town nurse, midwife, and a widow. She has delivered probably half the babies in this territory. She took care of the miners' wives for years. She knows what went on at that mine because she saw what came after, all the widows and the children who were left with nothing. A nurse is not what I would call a federal authority, no. But Clara Whitfield's late husband was Territorial Senator Thomas Whitfield. She still has friends in the governor's office, and she owes me a favor. Hart raised an eyebrow at that. It must be one hell of a favor. I saved her son's life during a cattle drive back in 1883. I pulled him out from under a full-blown stampede. She told me if I ever needed a single thing, she would move heaven and hell to make it happen. I think we are going to need both, Hart said. Jessie rode over to Clara's place the very next morning. She lived on the far edge of town. It was a small house with a tidy garden, even in the middle of winter. She was the sort of woman who could make things grow whether the ground liked it or not. She opened the door before he even had a chance to knock. She was 42 years old, with dark hair that had streaks of gray, and eyes that saw everything and forgave very little. Jessie Hollowell. I've been wondering when you were going to show your face. The whole town is buzzing about you and those girls. Can I... Come on in. You had best. I have got hot coffee and a heap of questions, and I am not sure which is stronger. They took a seat at her kitchen table. Jessie laid out the whole story. She just listened, never saying a word. After he was done, a long silence filled the room. Then she got up, went over to a cabinet, and pulled down a wooden box. She set it right on the table. I have been gathering these for 8 years, she said, and lifted the lid. Inside was a pile of letters, dozens of them written by miners and their wives, by widows, women who had lost their men at the White Fish Mine and were given a pittance to stay quiet. Every single woman who came to me after her husband died in that mine, Clara explained. I told them to write it all down, what really happened, what lies they were told, what they were paid, and just how much they were threatened. She took a breath. 12 women, 12 dead husbands, 12 stories nobody gave a damn to hear. Jessie just stared at the letters. Why did you hold on to these? Because someone had to. Because those women deserve to have their story told, even if no one was listening. She looked straight at Jessie. And because I knew one day someone would show up who was just stubborn enough to pick a fight. She sat back in her chair. What do you need me to do? I need you to get a hold of the governor's office. Get Judge Whitaker pulled from this custody hearing. Get us a judge who is fair. Clara gave a slow nod. I can do that. Thomas had some good people in the governor's mansion. Good, honest men. But Jessie, she warned, leaning in. That is going to take time. And Edgar is not a man who waits around. The second he gets wind that someone is messing with his judge, he will move like lightning. He will come after those girls. Let him try. Clara just shook her head. That is not going to be enough. You need this whole town standing with you, not just me and Father O'Brien. You need folks who will get up in that courtroom and tell them those children belong with you. You need people to witness the abuse. You need the doctor to testify about all those bruises. We do not have a doctor. You have me. Then I will be the one to testify. Clara's voice turned as hard as iron. I will tell them about every single bruise on those children's bodies, about the cigar burns on Eliza's arm, about them being half-starved, about why Hannah will not speak. She paused. And I will tell them what I saw when Edgar brought little Birdie to me last September with a broken wrist, telling me she took a tumble off a porch. Jessie froze. A broken wrist. She was 2 years old, Jessie. A 2-year-old does not break her wrist falling off a porch. Not like that one was broken. It was twisted clean around. The kind of break you see when a grown man grabs a little arm and yanks with all his might. You knew. You knew, and you did not say anything. For just a second, Clara's strong face fell apart, just long enough to see the guilt she was hiding. I told the marshal. I filed a whole report. Dunning just buried it. Said I was making a mountain out of a molehill. Said Edgar was a respected man in this town, and I should keep my nose out of his affairs. She wiped at her eyes. I have carried that with me every single day since, wondering if I should have done more, wondering if those little ones were hurting because I was not brave enough to fight harder. You are fighting now. Yes, I am, and I am not about to stop until those girls are safe. Jessie rode back to the ranch with a feeling he had not had in a long, long time. It was not exactly hope, but something tougher. It was determination. The kind you get when you know you are outgunned and outnumbered, but you choose to stand and fight anyway. He found Eliza back in the stable. She was brushing the mare, the very same horse Jessie had ridden through that blizzard the night he brought them home. Eliza had taken a shine to that animal right away. She spent an hour with her every single day. You sure like horses, Jesse said. Papa had a horse, a bay mare he called Penny. Edgar sold her right after Papa died. Eliza's voice was empty of feeling. I just stood there and watched him lead her away. Bertie cried for 3 whole days. Jesse leaned his shoulder against the stall door. I spoke with someone today, a woman by the name of Clara Whitfield. She's going to help us. How? She knows some folks in the governor's office. She's going to try and get the judge switched out so we can get a fair hearing. Eliza quit her brushing and looked over at Jesse. And if she cannot, if we are stuck with that same judge, then we fight him anyway with every last thing we have got. Eliza was quiet for a beat. Mr. Hollowell, there is something else I have not told you. Jesse waited. Papa did not just hide papers in that well. He hid something else, too. Something he told me about the night before he was killed. What was it? Eliza put the brush down. Her hands were trembling. Papa said that back when he worked at the mine, there was another man who saw the killing, a second witness, a man who ran away, just like Papa did. He changed his name and just vanished. She paused. Papa told me that if we ever needed real help, if the papers were not enough, this man could testify. He could stand up in a courtroom and tell everyone what he saw with his own 2 eyes. Who is he? Eliza looked right at Jesse. His name was Daniel. Daniel Harrove. But that is not his real name. Eliza swallowed hard. Papa said his real name was Nathan Hollowell. Jesse did not so much as twitch. He did not even draw a breath. The whole stable fell silent. Even the horses stopped their shuffling. Nathan Hollowell. It was his father's name, and his grandfather's name. A family name passed down from one generation to the next like an old scar. I do not know anybody named Nathan Hollowell, Jesse said. His own voice sounded like it was coming from a long way off. Papa said you would say that. Papa said you. He said you would not know him because he has been in hiding for 9 years, living under a fake name up in British Columbia. But Papa said Nathan was family. Eliza paused again. Papa said Nathan was your cousin, your uncle's son, the one everybody thought had died in the war. Jesse gripped the stall door, his knuckles turning white as bone. Matthew's boy. Uncle Matthew's son, Nathan. The cousin Jesse had grown up with. The cousin who had gone off to fight in 1863 and had never come home. The family had mourned him, put his name on a stone, said their prayers. And all this time he was alive, hiding out, running from the same men who had murdered Samuel. Where in British Columbia? A little town called Whitefish, right near the border. Papa wrote to him. He told him everything. He said if Samuel ever died, Nathan was supposed to come find you. Eliza's voice got quieter. Papa said Nathan has just been waiting for someone to finally fight back. He just needed to know it was safe. Jesse squeezed his eyes shut, feeling the whole crushing weight of it settle on him. His brother murdered, his cousin alive. A mine full of dead men, a judge in a banker's pocket, a banker who beat children, and 3 little girls caught right in the middle of it all. He opened his eyes and looked at Eliza. Is there anything else? Anything at all your father told you that you have not said? Eliza held his gaze. Just one more thing. Tell me. Papa said Edgar did not just kill him over the mine papers. He said Edgar killed him because Papa found out about something else. Something to do with Edgar's money. The bank. She hesitated. Papa said Edgar has been stealing from the estates of orphans for years. Every child in this territory who lost their parents, Edgar took their inheritance. He used it to fund the mine, to pay off the judge, to build his entire empire. A sour sickness churned in Jesse's stomach. A man who would steal from orphans, who would beat children, who would kill a father, and the law just looked the other way because the law was bought and paid for. How much? Papa reckoned it was thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, stolen from families who had nothing left. Eliza's chin started to tremble. Papa said some of those families nearly starved. Children got sent off to workhouses because the money their folks left for them was just gone. And Edgar just sat there in his bank and smiled. Jessie pulled Eliza into a hug. She did not pull away. For the very first time since she got there, she let someone hold her. She let herself be a little girl. She let all that tough armor fall away just long enough to feel the grief she had been carrying around for 6 long months. She did not cry. Not yet. That would come later. For now, she just stood there, her face buried in Jessie's chest, shaking like a leaf. "I am so tired, Mr. Hollowell. I know you are. I am tired of having to be brave." "Then just stop for a minute. I have got you." She trembled for a little while longer. Then the shaking stopped. She eased back, wiping her face on her sleeve. She looked up at him with those old eyes in that young face. "You are going to write to Nathan," she said. "Tonight. And you are going to get Clara to get rid of that judge, already working on it. And you are going to take those documents and burn Edgar Prescott's whole life right down to the ground, every last stick of it." Eliza nodded. "Good." She picked up the brush again and went back to the horse. Her hands were steady now. Her back was straight. "Mr. Hollowell." "Yeah?" Eliza did not turn around. She just kept on brushing, her voice soft but sure. "Papa was right about you. You are a good man." Jessie stood there in the stable doorway. The evening light was starting to fade. From inside the house, he could hear Lola singing something low in Spanish. He could hear Birdie laugh. It was the first time he had heard that little girl laugh. It was a small, bright, and surprised sound, like she had startled herself by remembering how to do it. And somewhere in that house, Hannah was drawing. She was drawing a world she could not talk about, a world that had hurt her in ways no child should ever be hurt. But she was also drawing a house with smoke curling from the chimney, and 4 figures standing in the window, and 2 words written at the bottom that meant more than any legal paper or court testimony or hidden piece of proof. Our house. Jesse turned his back on the stable and walked toward the laughter, toward the warmth, toward the coming fight, and the family that was already his. He had 6 weeks. A box filled with a dead man's truths. A nurse who knew people. A priest with a spine of steel. A lawyer with a hunger for justice. And 3 little girls who had walked through a blizzard because their father believed Jesse was a man worth walking to. He was going to prove Samuel right. 3 weeks crawled by. 3 weeks of waiting. 3 weeks of building something that started to feel like a real life, all while knowing it could be ripped to shreds in a courtroom on February 28th. Birdie got stronger. Her fever finally broke on day 5. By day 10, she was up and walking. By day 15, she was running through the house with a wild energy that wore out everyone but Lola, who had raised enough children to know that a toddler getting over pneumonia was either going to sleep or tear down everything in sight. She followed Jesse all over the place, out to the barn, across the yard, and into his study. She would sit right on his lap while he was trying to work on the books, grabbing for his pen and leaving little ink smudges on the ledger that Eliza would scold her for later. And she called him Papa every single time. Jesse had given up on correcting her. He had stopped wincing every time she said it. He had even started answering to it without a second thought, the same way you answer to your own name because it belongs to you, whether you picked it out or not. Hannah still was not talking, but she drew pictures every day. Lola collected stacks and stacks of them and kept them safe in a box in the kitchen. Some of the drawings were dark, showing the man with the belt, or the cellar with no light, or a little girl all by herself in the dark, covering her ears. But little by little, the pictures started to change. There were horses, the kitchen, Lola kneading bread, Birdie laughing, and always in every picture there was the house with 4 figures standing in the window. Eliza took to ranch work like she had been doing it her whole life. She could rope a fence post from 20 feet away, saddle a horse all by herself, and read the weather in the sky the way some children read from a book. She was tough and capable, but she was still sleeping with a knife under her pillow every night. Jesse never tried to take it from her. He understood why she needed it there. He understood that feeling safe was not something you believed in just because somebody told you to. It was something you had to earn back. one night at a time. The letter to Nathan Hollowell was sent out during the second week. Father O'Brien sent it by telegram all the way to Whitefish, British Columbia. It was short and careful, the kind of message that said everything by saying almost nothing at all. Family in Wyoming needs your help. Samuel sent us. Come if you can, Jesse. No answer ever came back. Not in the first week and not in the second. Jesse kept telling himself that it did not make a difference. He told himself their case was strong enough even without a witness from Canada. He told himself he was not one bit disappointed. He was lying. Clara Whitfield, on the other hand, worked fast. She sent 2 letters to the governor's office and then made a personal trip to the territorial capital herself. She came back on a Thursday, covered in dust, tired clear through, and smiling for the first time since Jesse had known her. Judge Whitaker has been removed from the case, she announced. They were all sitting in Jesse's kitchen. Lola poured the coffee. Eliza stood over in the doorway, listening. Jesse had learned that about her. She listened to everything. She did not miss a single thing. The governor's office looked into the conflict of interest. Whitaker owns a piece of the same mine that is connected to Edgar Prescott. They cannot have him presiding over a custody case that involves Edgar's own wards. A new judge has been assigned. Clara paused for a moment. Her name is Margaret Harlow, out of Helena. A woman? Jesse asked. A woman. She's the first female judge in the entire territory, appointed just 6 months ago. She's known for being fair and for having an absolute hatred of corruption. Clara cracked a smile. Edgar Prescott has no earthly idea what is about to hit him. Jesse felt something come loose inside his chest, a knot he had been carrying around for weeks. What about Edgar? Does he know yet? He will find out the moment he steps foot in that courtroom, and by that time it will be far too late for him to buy his way out of it. Eliza spoke up from the doorway. He will try something else. He always does. Clara looked over at the girl. You are right about that. He will. And that is exactly why we need to be ready for anything and everything. That night, Jesse just could not sleep. He lay there in bed, just staring up at the dark ceiling. 3 days until the hearing. 3 days until some judge he had never even met would decide if 3 little girls he had only known for 6 weeks would get to stay, or if they would be sent straight back to a man who put out cigars on them and locked them up in cellars. There was a soft knock at his door. Come on in. It was Eliza, standing there in the doorway in her nightgown, her feet bare, looking younger than she had since the first night she got here. Cannot sleep either, she said. No, ma'am. She came on in, sat right back to that house. Jessie sat up straight and looked right at her. This little girl, who for 6 long months had been hauling a burden meant for 2 grown men. This child who had not seen a peaceful night's sleep since June, who was only 9 years old but was already making plans for what to do if every grown-up in her world let her down again. You listen to me, Eliza. I will not let that happen. But if it does, if the whole world just goes sideways and the law fails us, then I will put you and your sisters on a horse, and we will ride out together. I am not sending you off into the cold all by yourself again. You hear me? Eliza just stared at him. Her little chin started to tremble. You really mean that? I mean every word of it, even if it means I gotta break the law, even if they come hunting for you. Even then, she whispered. She was quiet for a good long while. Then she leaned against his shoulder, so small and warm, trusting him in a way she had not since that very first night. Papa would have liked you, she whispered. I reckon I would have liked him too. Should have told him that when I had the chance. They just sat there in the quiet. The old house groaned around them, the wind pushing against the windows, the fire turning to embers in the other room. You ought to get some sleep, Jessie said. So should you. I will sleep when this is all over. Eliza gave a small, sad smile. You sound just like me. She went on back to her room. Jessie heard the door click shut, heard the bed springs whine, and then heard nothing more. He sure hoped she was sleeping. hoped that knife was still under her pillow, but that her hand was not wrapped around its handle. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and real bright. February 28th. The kind of day where the air was so sharp it stole your breath, but so clear you felt like you could see 50 miles in any direction. Jesse got dressed in his Sunday best, a clean shirt, good boots, and the coat Catherine had given him the Christmas before she passed. He had not put it on in 4 years. It still held the faint smell of cedar from the chest where Lola kept it safe. The girls were all ready. Lola had been up late sewing them new dresses. Eliza's was a pretty blue. Hannah's was sunshine yellow. Birdie's was white with tiny flowers that Lola had stitched by hand, staying up every night for 2 weeks straight to finish them. They looked like proper children, not like strays or runaways. They looked like children who were looked after, loved, and whole. Eliza came to find Jessie in the kitchen. Her hair was in a neat braid, and she stood up tall and straight. She looked like a little soldier marching off to battle. "Ready?" Jessie asked her. "No," she said, "but let us go anyway." They all rode into town together. Jessie and Eliza were on horseback. Lola drove the wagon with Hannah and Birdie tucked in beside her. The morning was still, with no wind and no sound but the clop of hooves on the frozen dirt. The courthouse was already packed to the rafters when they got there. 60 folks crammed into a room built to hold 30. It was standing room only. Seemed the whole town had turned out to watch. Jesse saw faces he knew. Miguel, his head ranch hand, was standing in the back holding his hat in his hands. Rosa Chen from the general store, who had given them the fabric for the girls' dresses and would not take a penny for it. Jenkins, the blacksmith, who had fixed Jesse's gate latch the week before and had told him quiet-like man to man that he was doing the right thing. And over on the other side there was Edgar Prescott sitting at the petitioner's table all by himself, dressed to the nines, clean-shaven. The very picture of a man who had never done a lick of wrong in his life. He looked at Jesse when they walked in and he smiled. It was the same smile he gave you when he was approving your loan. The same smile he gave you when he was foreclosing on your home. Next to him, Marshal Wade Dunning sat in the front row. His badge shined up bright, his face like a stone. The law, bought and paid for. Jesse took his seat, his heart pounded next to him. Eliza sat behind him with Lola and the girls. He could feel Eliza's eyes burning into the back of his neck. He could feel her fear. He could feel her trying with all her might to be brave. All rise. They all stood. The door behind the judge's bench swung open. Judge Margaret Harlow walked in. 55 years old. Gray hair pulled back tight. A face you could not read no more than a closed book. She sat down, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom, taking it all in at once. Edgar's smile flickered. Jesse saw it. Just for a heartbeat. Just a half-second of pure confusion. He had been counting on Whitaker, had planned for Whitaker, had Whitaker in his pocket. He had not planned on her. "Be seated," Judge Harlow said, her voice filling the room without any effort at all. "We are here on the matter of the custody and guardianship of 3 minor children. Eliza May Colton, Hannah Grace Colton, and Birdie Colton." She looked straight at Edgar. "Mr. Prescott, you are the petitioner. You may begin." Edgar got to his feet, smooth and collected, that smile locked back in place. "Your Honor, I am the legal guardian of these 3 children appointed by their late father's will. They have been missing from my care for 6 weeks. I have reason to believe they are being held unlawfully by Mr. Jesse Hollowell." "Held." Judge Harlow repeated the word, her voice flat. "You are saying he is keeping them against their will." "I am saying, Your Honor, that a single man with no wife, no female kinfolk, and no legal right has taken 3 young girls into his home without any authority or supervision." Edgar's voice was as smooth as Riverstone, practiced and reasonable. "Whatever he thinks he is doing, the situation is not proper." Hart stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Hollowell is not holding these children. They came to him in the middle of a blizzard, half dead, running from the abuse they suffered at the hands of Mr. Prescott. Objection. Edgar's voice turned sharp. That is a mighty serious thing to say with no proof. Judge Harlow looked straight at Hart. Do you have any proof, Counselor? We surely do, Your Honor. Hart opened his leather satchel. We have a medical testimony, statements from witnesses, and papers showing the injuries all three girls got while they were living with Mr. Prescott. Hart called Clara Whitfield to the stand first. Clara walked up, sat down, and fixed her steady gaze right on Edgar. Mrs. Whitfield, you looked at the children. I did, 3 times since they got to Mr. Hollowell's ranch. Clara's voice was clear and professional. The voice of a woman who had brought babies into the world, set broken bones, and had to tell mothers their children would not make it through the night. Eliza Colton has bruises on her back and upper arms that look like they came from a belt. She has 3 round burn scars on her left forearm, cigar burns put there on purpose. Hannah Colton has similar belt marks, but they are older and layered, which tells me she was beaten again and again for months. And Bertie Colton, Clara took a breath. Bertie Colton shows signs of a left wrist that was broken before and healed all wrong, looking just like a wrist that was grabbed and twisted hard by a grown-up's hand. A low rumble went through the courtroom. Judge Harlow's gavel came down once. You have seen Bertie's wrist before, Mrs. Whitfield. Back last September, Mr. Prescott brought her to me. He said she fell off the porch. I filed a report about it with the marshal's office. Clara looked right at Dunning. That report was never looked into. Dunning's face turned beet red. He shuffled in his chair but said not a word. Edgar got to his feet. Your Honor, children fall down, they get bruises. Mrs. Whitfield is not a doctor. She is just a midwife with a wild imagination. Judge Harlow glared at him. Sit down, Mr. Prescott. You will get your chance to talk. Hart called Eliza up next. The little girl walked to the stand, looking so small in that big witness chair. Her feet did not even touch the floor, but her back was straight, and her eyes were clear as glass. Eliza, Hart said in a soft voice, can you tell the court what it was like living with Mr. Prescott? Eliza looked over at Edgar. He gave her a smile. It was the kind of smile that was really a threat. She looked away from him and found Jessie in the crowd. Jessie gave her a slow nod. Uncle Edgar hit us, Eliza said. Her voice was steady as a rock, mostly with his belt, but sometimes with his hand. He burned me with his cigar 3 times. He locked Hannah in the root cellar for 3 whole days just because she spilled some milk on his desk. When she finally got out, she was not talking anymore. She has not said a word since then. The courtroom was completely still. Judge Harlow was writing, her face impossible to read. Eliza went on, some days he would not give us any food. He said we had to earn our supper. Bertie was always hungry. She cried a lot, and that just made him meaner. One night, he grabbed her arm and twisted it. I heard the bone snap. She paused. That was the night I knew we had to run away. Edgar jumped up again, jumped up. Your Honor, this child has been coached. Mr. Hollowell has clearly told her what to say to back up his own illegal claim. Judge Harlow's eyes turned to ice. Mr. Prescott, if you interrupt this testimony one more time, I will hold you in contempt of court. Sit down. Edgar sat, but his smile was long gone. Eliza was not done yet. Before my papa died, he told me to find Mr. Hollowell. He said he was family. He said he was the only one in the whole world who could keep us safe. She dug into her pocket and pulled out a worn letter from Samuel. Papa wrote this. It tells everything. Who Edgar really is, what he did, and why we had to get away. Hart took the letter and gave it to the judge. Judge Harlow read it slowly, her expression shifting as she went from neutral to focused, then to something much harder. She laid the letter down and looked at Edgar. Mr. Prescott, This letter makes some very serious claims, including that you were directly part of the reason these children's father is dead. Lies, Edgar snapped. Just the crazy talk of a paranoid man who died in a simple wagon accident. Hart stood. Your Honor, we have more proof. He pulled out the journal they found in the well, along with documents Samuel Colton had hidden away before he died. These papers lay out the whole operation of the Whitefish mine up in British Columbia, including 12 deaths that were called accidents and the names of Mr. Prescott, Marshall Wade Dunning's brother, Jacob Dunning, and the old judge Arthur Whitaker as co-owners of that mine. The courtroom went up for grabs. People were shouting. Dunning was on his feet. Edgar's face had gone pale as a sheet. Judge Harlow's gavel hit the desk hard. 3 times. Order. I will have order, or I will clear this courtroom. A heavy, loaded silence fell. Judge Harlow looked at the documents, taking her time to read every single page. The courtroom waited for 5 minutes, then 10. Nobody even breathed. Finally, she looked up. Marshall Dunning stepped forward. Dunning walked toward the bench, stiff as a board, his hand resting near his gun. These papers say your brother was the foreman at a mine owned by Mr. Prescott. A mine where 12 men died in ways that look mighty suspicious. Is your brother's name Jacob Dunning? Dunning's jaw worked back and forth. I refuse to answer, Your Honor. This is not a criminal trial, Marshal. I am asking you a straight question. Is Jacob Dunning your brother? Yes, ma'am. He is. And did you bury a report filed by Mrs. Whitfield about the injuries to the child, Bertie Colton? Dunning glanced at Edgar. Edgar just stared at the table. I might have misplaced the paperwork, Dunning mumbled. Judge Harlow just stared at him. Take off your badge, Marshal. You are suspended until we get to the bottom of this. She turned to the bailiff. Take Mr. Dunning into custody. He is not to leave this building. 2 men stepped up. Dunning did not put up a fight. He just stood there while they took his badge, his gun, and his power. Everything that had made him a man. Nobody could touch. Edgar stood up slowly, his calm expression starting to crack, with lines spreading across his respectable face like ice breaking up on a pond in spring. Your Honor, I would like to speak to the court. You may. Edgar looked around the room, at all the faces watching him, at the town he had run for a decade, at the folks who had trusted him with their money, their children, and their futures. Then his eyes landed on Eliza, on Hannah clutching her drawings, on Bertie sitting in Lola's lap, and finally on Jessie. I am not going to stand here and say none of it is true, Edgar said. His voice was different now, quiet. All the charm had been stripped away. What was left was something tired and ugly and real. I hit those children. I burned that girl. I locked the little one in the dark. I did every bit of it. The courtroom fell dead silent. I did it because I'm a coward. I did it because Samuel Colton figured out what I was, and I could not let him tell everyone. Because after he was gone, I had his children, and they knew too much, and I did not know what else to do but make them scared of me. Edgar's hands were trembling. I stole from the estates of orphans, 6 different families, $4,000. I used that money to run the mine, to pay off Whitaker, to keep the whole crooked thing going. He looked right at Jessie. Your brother was a better man than I could ever hope to be. He died because he had the guts to do what I never could. Tell the truth. Edgar turned back to the judge. I am withdrawing my request for custody. I am turning myself over to this court. And I am asking that these children be put in the care of Jessie Hollowell, not because the law says it, but because it is the first right thing I have done in 20 years. He sat down. The courtroom was completely still. Somewhere in the back, someone was crying. It was Rosa Chen with her hand pressed to her mouth. Judge Harlow was quiet for a long time, just writing and thinking. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath. Then she looked at Jessie. Mr. Hollowell, please stand. Jessie got to his feet. These children showed up on your doorstep in a blizzard. You took them in. You gave them food. You kept them safe. You put your good name, your own safety, and your livelihood on the line for 3 little girls who are not even your own blood. She paused. Why? Jessie looked at Eliza, then at Hannah, then at Bertie, who was reaching for him from Lola's lap, her little arms stretched out, the word Papa just starting to form on her lips. "Because someone had to," he said, "and because my brother asked me to, and because," his voice cracked a little, "because I lost a daughter of my own 4 years back, and I swore I would never let myself love another child again. And then these three showed up at my gate, half frozen, and proved me wrong." Judge Harlow watched him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "In the case of Eliza May Colton, Hannah Grace Colton, and Bertie Colton, I am awarding full and legal custody to Jessie Wade Hollowell, effective right now." She brought the gavel down. "Furthermore, I am ordering a full criminal investigation into Edgar Prescott, the Whitefish Mine, and anyone else involved." The gavel came down one last time. The courtroom erupted. Jessie turned. Eliza was already running to him. She slammed into him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face buried deep in his chest. "Not crying, not yet. Just holding on tight." Hannah stood right behind her, silent as ever, still clutching those drawings, but she was looking at Jessie. And for the very first time since he had met her, she was smiling. Lola brought Bertie forward. The little baby reached out for Jessie. He took her. She grabbed his collar with both her tiny hands and buried her face in his neck. "Papa," she said. "Home." Jessie held them. He held all of them. Bertie in one arm, Eliza pressed against his chest, Hannah standing close enough to touch. Lola stood behind them with tears streaming down her face, her rosary beads clicking softly at her waist. Clara Whitfield caught his eye from across the room. She gave him one single nod. That was all. That was more than enough. Father O'Brien was praying under his breath, his lips moving, his eyes shut tight. And in the back of the courtroom, as the bailiff led him away, Edgar Prescott looked back one last time. He looked at the children he had hurt so badly, at the man who had saved them, at the life he had torn apart, and the life he could never have. Then the door closed behind him, and he was gone. Jessie stood there in the middle of that courtroom, holding a dead man's daughters, hearing a word he thought he would never hear again. And he felt something crack wide open inside his chest. It was not grief this time, and it was not rage. It was something else, something he had forgotten could even exist. Eliza pulled back a little, looking up at him with those blue-gray eyes that saw everything. "We did it," she said. "We did? Is it finally over?" Jessie looked down at her, then at Hannah, then at Bertie, at this family he had found in the middle of a blizzard and fought for in a courthouse, and that he would spend the rest of his days trying to be worthy of. "The hard part is over," he told her. "The good part is just getting started." Eliza smiled. A real full smile. The first one he had ever seen from her. It changed her whole face, made her look like what she was, a 9-year-old girl who had finally set down a weight she never should have been made to carry. "Can we go home now?" Jessie pulled her in close. "Yeah, little one. We can go home." They all walked out of the courthouse together, into the cold, into the bright sunshine, into a February morning that felt like the very first day of something brand new. And for the first time since he had buried his own daughter in the hard ground behind the barn, Jessie Hollowell walked with his head held high and his chest open, his arms full of children who called him Papa, and truly meant it. The ride home was quiet. But it was not the heavy quiet of sorrow or fear. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something breaks open, and you do not rightly know yet what shape the new thing will take. Bertie fell fast asleep in Jessie's arms before they even reached the edge of town. Her little fist was curled up in his collar, her breathing was steady, the fever was gone, and the bruises were fading. 3 years old and already learning that the world could be a safe place again. Hannah sat in the wagon with Lola. She was drawing. Of course she was drawing. But when Jessie glanced back, he saw what she was making. It was not the man with the belt, not the cellar, not the dark things. She was drawing the courthouse, the judge, and Jessie standing right in the middle with 3 small figures gathered all around him. Eliza rode beside Jessie on the mare she had already claimed as her own. Her back was straight, her chin was up, and the wind was in her hair. She looked like a whole different girl from the one who had stumbled through his gate 6 weeks ago. Same face, same eyes, but something deep down inside her had shifted. The armor was still there. It might always be there, but it was not locked up quite so tight anymore. They reached the ranch gate. Jesse slid off his horse, handed Bertie up to Lola, and unlatched the gate. The iron did not stick this time. The hinges did not scream. It was a small thing, meant nothing really, but Jesse noticed it all the same. Eliza swung down from her mare and stood there looking at the house. Mr. Hollowell. Yeah. Can I ask you something? You can ask me anything, Eliza. You know that. She was quiet for a moment. The wind stirred her hair. She pushed it back with a hand that was not shaking anymore. Are you going to change now that it is official? Now that the judge said we are yours? Are you going to turn into someone different? Jesse looked at her, and he understood the real question she was asking. Every grown-up in her life had changed on her. Her father went from being alive to being gone. Her uncle went from being her guardian to being a monster. The marshal went from being a protector to being a predator. People changed. People became the ugly things they were hiding. I am going to try to be better, Jesse said. Every single day. Some days I will likely fail, but I'm not going to become someone else. I'm going to be the same man you met the night I pulled Bertie out of the snow. That man, just trying to do the right thing and messing it up half the time. Eliza studied him with that long, measuring look she gave everyone. Then she nodded. Good, she said, because I like that man. He is not perfect, but he stays. She turned and walked toward the house. Jesse watched her go. 9 years old and already wiser than most folks get in a whole lifetime. The weeks after the hearing moved like a river, running fast in some spots, slowing down in others, and pooling in places you would not expect. Edgar Prescott went to trial up in Cheyenne. He pleaded guilty to embezzlement, guilty to child abuse, and guilty to conspiracy in the death of Samuel Colton. The jury was out for 40 minutes. He got 12 years in the territorial prison. He would die in there. Everybody knew it. Edgar knew it too. He accepted it with the same quiet he had shown in the courtroom. Jesse did not go to the trial. He did not need to. Clara went, Father O'Brien went, and Hart went. They came back with the verdict, a bottle of whiskey and a handshake that said more than words ever could. Marshal Dunning was stripped of his badge and charged as an accessory. His brother Jacob was arrested up in British Columbia and brought back down. The mine was shut down for good. The families of the 12 dead, the men responsible, were called to account. The court ordered them to pay, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. Still, it was something. Judge Whitaker had to step down. He lost his job. He lost his good name. He lost every last thing but his freedom, which felt wrong to Jesse. But it was not something he could fix. Some men just break easy. That is how the world works sometimes. The little town of Elkhorn Creek settled into a new rhythm, the way small towns always do. The whispers behind cupped hands turned from suspicion to praise. The very same folks who had talked about a single man keeping 3 young girls were now showing up with fresh-baked pies and offering to help with the ranch work, telling Jesse they knew he was a good man all along. Jesse just let them talk. He did not believe half of it, but he let them say their piece because the girls needed to see it. They needed to see that a community could have a good heart, that people could find their way to the right side of things, even if it took them a while. Bertie was shooting up like a weed after a good rain. That is what happens when a child finally gets enough to eat and enough hugs and is told she is loved over and over. She started talking in full sentences, stringing her words together like she was making a necklace. And most of those words were for Jesse. Papa, look. Papa, come here. Papa, hold me. Papa, that horse is so big. Papa, Lola baked cookies. Papa, I love you. That last one just slipped out on a plain old Tuesday morning. Jesse was sitting there tying his bootlaces. Bertie was on the floor with some wooden blocks Lola had whittled for her. She just looked right up at him, gave him a big smile, and said it like it was the truest thing in the whole world. I love you, Papa. Jesse's hands froze on his laces. The world got a little blurry. He had to blink hard to clear his eyes. "I love you too, Bertie." She just turned back to her blocks. That was all there was to it. It was not some big production. There was no soaring music. It was just a 3-year-old girl speaking a truth she had been feeling for weeks and had finally found the words for. Jesse finished up with his boots, walked into the kitchen, and poured himself some coffee. He drank it just standing there by the window, with tears tracking down his cheeks and not a single reason in the world to wipe them away. Lola found him like that. She took one look at him and did not even ask. "This coffee is a bit stout," Jesse said. "That is the same coffee I have been making for 20 years, Mr. Hollowell. Well, must be the high altitude then." Lola just smiled, patted his arm, and went on back to her bread dough. Hannah's quiet streak held on. The weeks rolled into months, and she still was not speaking a word. Jesse worried about it. Lola worried too. Clara Whitfield came out once a week to see how she was doing and left every time with that same look on her face, the one that said be patient but also said she was concerned. Eliza, though, she did not seem to worry, or if she did, she kept it tucked away. "Hannah will talk when she is good and ready." Eliza told Jesse, "You cannot rush a thing like that. She has kept it all bottled up inside for so long. She has to figure out on her own how to let it all go again." She took a breath. "The drawings are helping. You ought to look at them. I mean, really look." So Jesse did just that, spreading them all out on his desk one evening. 47 drawings. He laid them out in the order she had made them and saw exactly what Eliza was talking about. The first ones were all dark and gloomy, made with heavy charcoal and angry scribbles. There was the man with the belt, the dark cellar, the broken wrist, just pure fear drawn out in black on brown paper. But then, little by little, they started to change. The lines got softer. Then color started to show up. Lola had given Hannah a set of colored pencils, and that little girl used them like she was learning a whole new way to talk. Green for all the grass, blue for the big sky, yellow for Bertie's hair, brown for the horses. The people in the pictures changed too. The man with the belt, he vanished right around drawing 23. In his place was a tall man wearing a cowboy hat. It was Jesse, standing there between the little girls and whatever was just off the page, protecting them. Not with his fists, just by being there. The very last drawing in the pile was a world apart from the rest, bigger and with more care put into it. Hannah had worked on it for 3 whole days. It was a picture of the ranch, the main house, the big barn, the fence line stretching out, and right there in the yard were 5 people: Jesse, Eliza, Hannah herself, Bertie, and Lola. They were all holding hands. Down at the bottom, in letters that were getting stronger and more sure of themselves, Hannah had written just 3 words: "This is home." Jesse gathered the drawings up, put them back in order, and slid them into a box. He put that box in the bottom drawer of his desk, the very same drawer where he used to keep his whiskey. The whiskey was long gone. Had been ever since that first night Bertie called him Papa. He did not need it anymore. He had something better now. Something that filled up that same empty spot inside, but did not leave him hollowed out afterward. Morning came, and with it the first big thaw of April. The snow all melted off, and the creeks started to run high. The whole valley turned from white to brown and then to that first faint hint of green. The cattle that made it through the winter were on the thin side, but they were alive. The ranch was going to make it. It would just take some time. Anything worthwhile always takes time. One Saturday morning in the middle of April, Jesse was out mending the fence on the north pasture. Eliza was right there with him. She would hold the post steady while he hammered in the nails. They worked in that kind of easy silence that settles between people who have learned each other's ways. "Mr. Hollowell," Eliza said, "we have been over this. You can just call me Jessie." "I know." Eliza took the hammer and drove a nail in herself. Put it in straight and true. She was getting stronger every day. "But I like calling you Mr. Hollowell. It just feels right." She stopped for a second. "Maybe one of these days I will call you something else when I am ready." Jesse understood. He did not push her on it. Someday was good enough for him. Someday was a promise of more time, more days like this, more fence posts to hold and nails to hammer and quiet to share between them. They were heading back toward the house when Jesse spotted a rider coming up the road from town. He was moving at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. It was the gait of a man who had been traveling a long way and was finally getting close to where he was going. Jesse came to a stop. His hand drifted down to his hip. It was just an old habit. He was not carrying a firearm, had not worn one since the girls arrived. He did not want guns in a house with little ones. Eliza put a hand up to shield her eyes from the sun. "Who is that?" "I do not know." The rider came on closer. He was a man, maybe in his 30s, with dark hair, a lean build, and a coat covered in the dust of a long journey. He pulled his horse up about 20 feet from the gate, his eyes going from Jesse to Eliza, and then to the ranch itself. Then he reached up and took off his hat, and Jesse finally saw his face, the set of his jaw, the look in his eyes, the way he carried himself. It was like looking into a mirror that showed you how you might have turned out if your life had gone down a different path. Jesse could not find his voice. The man swung down from his horse, slow and deliberate, standing there holding his hat in both hands, looking nervous and not quite sure of himself. A grown man who looked like a boy, hoping someone would tell him he had come to the right place. "I got your telegram," the man said. "It took me a spell. I had to make sure the coast was clear to travel." He hesitated for a moment. "I am Nathan. Nathan Hollowell, though I have not gone by that name in 9 years." Jesse just stared at his cousin, the boy he had grown up alongside, the boy his family had grieved for, the boy who was supposed to be dead and in the ground back in Virginia. But here he was, standing right in Jesse's own yard, alive and worn by the years, carrying 9 years of hiding in the lines around his eyes. "Nathan," Jesse finally managed to say. The name felt both foreign and familiar, like a shirt you had not worn in ages that somehow still fit perfectly. Nathan looked right at him. "Uncle Matthew always said you were the most stubborn man in all of Wyoming. Said you would argue with a fence post and come out on top." He was not wrong. A small smile almost touched Nathan's lips. Then his face turned serious again. "I came on account of Samuel, because of what he asked me to do. I was there, Jesse. I was at that mine. I saw the whole thing happen. I saw Dunning kill that man. I saw them cover it all up. I ran, just like Samuel did. But I never did stop being scared. You do not have to be scared anymore. Dunning is in custody. Edgar is serving time. The mine has been shut down for good." Nathan looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy boulder up a long hill and was just now being told he could finally set it down. "It is really over. It is really over." Nathan's chin fell to his chest. His shoulders started to shake. He just stood there in the yard and cried the way a man cries when he has had to be strong for far too long, and all that strength is not needed anymore. Jesse walked over to him, put a hand on his cousin's shoulder, and just kept it there, the way Eliza had taught him. Not trying to fix anything, not saying a word, just being present. After a bit, Nathan wiped his face and looked over at Eliza. This must be Samuel's daughter. Eliza had been watching Nathan the same way she watched everybody, taking his measure, sizing him up. But her gaze was softer now, the sharp edges worn down. "I am Eliza. Papa used to talk about you. He said you were brave." Nathan let out a laugh, but it was a wet, broken sound. "Brave? I have been hiding out in Canada for 9 years. There is nothing brave about that." Eliza just shrugged her shoulders. "You came back here, did not you? That is brave enough." Nathan looked back at Jesse. "She is just like Samuel. She has got that same way of making you feel like you can do just about anything. She gets that from her father. Come on inside. You look like you have not had a square meal in a week." They all sat down together around the kitchen table, every one of them. Jesse, Nathan, Eliza, Lola, with Birdie sitting in Jesse's lap, picking biscuit crumbs off his shirt. Hannah was in her corner drawing. Nathan started to tell his story. He told them about the mine, the murder, the 9 long years of running, all the small towns and the made-up names, and the kind of loneliness that just eats you alive from the inside out, when you could not tell a soul who you were or explain the fear you lived with. He laid the story out plain, with no theatrics. He told it the way men do when they are weary of carrying that weight. When he finished, Lola poured him another cup of coffee. Eliza started asking questions, sharp ones, the kind you would expect from a lawyer. Nathan answered every single one. Jesse finally asked, "Will you testify against Dunning's brother in the trial? Will you stand up in court and tell them what you saw?" Nathan stayed quiet for what felt like a long time. He just stared at the coffee in his hands, watching the steam rise, taking in the warm kitchen, the children, the peace. "Yes," he said. "I will testify. I am done with hiding." He looked right at Jesse. "Samuel died because he had the courage to speak the truth. The least I can do is see it through." Jesse just nodded. He felt a certain peace settle over him. It felt like a circle was finally closing, a debt was being settled, It was not for the law, it was not for the dead. It was for Samuel, for the brother who had put his trust in him one last time, and had been right to do so. Later that night, after Nathan was settled in a spare room and the girls were tucked in bed, the house grew quiet. Jesse sat out on the porch. The sky was clear with so many stars it looked like someone had spilled a bucket of diamonds. The air was still cold, but it was not a bitter, cruel cold. It was just crisp enough to make you feel alive with every breath. And that is when Eliza came out and sat down next to him. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. It was Lola's blanket, the one that always smelled a little like cinnamon and cedar wood. They sat there for a few minutes without saying a word. It was the comfortable kind of silence you share with people who do not need words to understand each other. "Mr. Hollowell," Eliza said at last. "Yeah." "Do you reckon Papa knows we are all right? That you kept your promise to him?" Jesse looked up at that big, dark sky, at all those stars and the impossible weight of it all. "I have to think he does, because that is what I choose to believe. And sometimes believing is all it takes to make something true." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. She was small and warm. The weight of her was not a burden at all, but an anchor. Something that kept him tied to the world when all the grief and guilt tried to pull him away. "I stopped sleeping with a knife," she said softly. Jesse froze. "When?" "Last week. After the hearing." She paused for a moment. "I woke up in the middle of the night and my hand went right for it. But then I thought to myself, I do not need this anymore. So I put it away in the drawer and went right back to sleep." A lump formed in Jesse's throat. He put his arm around her and pulled her in closer. "That is the bravest thing I've ever heard, Eliza. Braver than walking through a blizzard. Much braver." She smiled against his shoulder. "Can I tell you something else?" "Always." "Hannah spoke today." Jesse turned to look at her straight on. "What?" "This afternoon, when you were out mending the fence, Birdie just reached over and took her pencil right out of her hand. And Hannah," Eliza's voice trembled a little, "Hannah said, 'Give it back, Birdie, that is mine.'" 5 words, Eliza corrected herself. 5 whole words, the first she has said in 8 months. Jesse covered his eyes with his hand. He just took a breath, and then another. "What did you do?" "Nothing. I did not want to make a big deal out of it and scare her. I just looked at her and she looked back at me. Then she went back to her drawing and Birdie gave the pencil back, and that was it." "That was it," Eliza whispered. "That was everything." They sat there on the porch as the night grew darker and deeper. As the stars wheeled across the sky, the cold tried to press in, but it could not touch them. They were together, and being together was warm enough. Inside the house, Nathan slept in a proper bed for the first time in months. Lola had left a single candle burning in his window, just like she used to for Jesse after Rosie passed. It was just a little light against all that dark, a way of saying, "You are not alone here, even with the door closed." In their room, Hannah and Bertie were asleep, all tangled up the way they always were. Bertie's little hand was lost in Hannah's hair. Hannah's arm was wrapped around Bertie's waist, and sitting on the nightstand was Hannah's newest drawing. It showed 5 people standing in front of a house, all holding hands. And down at the bottom, in letters that were surer and steadier than he had ever seen from her, were 5 words that changed the whole world. This is my family now. The morning came, and for the first time since January, it brought warmth. Jessie woke up to the sound of laughter. It started with a sound, then another, Bertie's happy, high-pitched giggle. Then came Eliza's laugh, the full and rare kind. And right there with them, soft but as clear as a bell, was Hannah laughing. That was a sound no one in that house had ever heard. Jessie just laid there in his bed and let it all sink in. He let that sound wash over him, filling up rooms that had been hollow and silent for 4 long years. He let it find its way into all the dark corners where sorrow had gathered like dust, and he let it sweep them all clean. He got up, put on his clothes, and walked on down to the kitchen. The whole bunch of them were there. Lola was at the stove making pancakes. Eliza was busy setting the table. Hannah was at her spot, drawing with a colored pencil clutched in each little hand. And there was Bertie sitting on the floor, trying with all her might to pull Jessie's big old boot onto her foot, and failing in the most wonderful way. Nathan was at the table, a cup of coffee in his hand, just watching all the happy commotion. He had the look of a man who had clean forgotten what a family sounded like, and was suddenly remembering it all at once. Jessie stood there in the doorway, just taking it all in. Bertie was the first one to see him. Her face broke into a smile so big it looked like it took over her whole tiny body. "Papa," she said, holding up the boot. "Too big," Jessie said. "It is way too big, sweetheart. Give it about 15 more years." He walked over to the table and sat himself down. Lola set a plate in front of him. Eliza poured his coffee without even being asked. She knew exactly how he liked it. Black, hot, and no sugar. She had picked that up her first week there and never once forgot. Hannah looked up from her drawing, looked right at Jessie, and she spoke. "Good morning." Just 2 words, quiet, barely more than a whisper. But those 2 words hit that kitchen like a clap of thunder. It was like the whole house had been holding its breath for 8 long months and had finally, all at once, let it go. Lola dropped her spatula with a clatter, crossed herself, and just started crying right into the pancake batter. Eliza's eyes welled up with tears, but she would not let a single one fall. She just smiled at her little sister. It was the kind of smile that said, "I knew you could do it. I always knew." Nathan turned his head away, wiped his face on his sleeve, and pretended like he was not weeping into his coffee cup. Jessie just looked at Hannah, at this little 6-year-old girl who had quit talking because words had been turned into weapons in Edgar Prescott's house. This little girl who had spent 8 months telling her whole story with charcoal and paper. And now she had found her voice again, right here in a kitchen that smelled like pancakes and coffee, and the special kind of warmth that comes from people who choose to be a family. "Good morning, Hannah," Jessie said, his voice coming out steady, even though every part of him felt like it was shaking. Hannah looked him right in the eye and held his gaze for a long moment. Then she went back to her drawing, but the corners of her lips were turned up. It was not quite a smile, but it was the start of one, the seed of one. It was the promise that more words were on their way, and laughter too. And someday maybe even the full, happy voice of a child who remembered that it was safe to speak. Because the people around her would never, ever use her own words to hurt her. Jessie ate his breakfast, drank his coffee, and just listened to the wonderful noise of 5 people in a kitchen that used to hold only one. He let it fill him up. He let it change him. He let it do what the whiskey and the silence and 4 long years of grief never could. It made him whole again. After they finished breakfast, Jessie walked out onto the front porch. The whole valley was green and coming to life. The snow was all gone except for on the highest mountain peaks. The cattle were grazing in the very same fields that had nearly been the end of them just 3 months ago. Life was coming back, just the way life always does. Stubborn, relentless, and just plain unwilling to stay beaten down. Eliza came out and stood there right beside him. "Mr. Hollowell." "Yeah." She was quiet for a second. Then she took his hand and her small fingers laced right through his, the same way Rosie used to do when they would walk down to the barn. It was the way a child holds on to the one person in the whole world they trust the most. "Thank you," Eliza said, "for that first night and for all the nights that came after." Jessie gave her hand a squeeze. He could not find the words to speak, but he did not need to. They just stood there, watching the valley wake up, watching the morning light spread all across the land, watching the world prove that even after the worst winter anybody could remember, spring always comes. It always does. You just have to be tough enough to survive long enough to see it. Behind them, the house was full of life. Lola was singing in Spanish, Birdie was laughing, Hannah was drawing, and Nathan was telling a story about a bear he had met up in British Columbia, a story that Birdie made him tell over and over again. They were a family, broken and put back together, scarred up and healing, not perfect, but here. And they were more than Jessie Hollowell ever thought he deserved. He had buried a daughter, he had lost a brother, and he had spent 4 years turning himself into stone. And then 3 little girls walked right out of a blizzard and proved to him that the heart he thought was long dead was only sleeping, waiting for someone brave enough to wake it up. Eliza leaned her head against his arm. "Papa would be proud of you," she said. Jessie looked down at her, at this fierce, wise, and impossibly strong child. This girl who had carried her sisters through a blizzard, carried a dead man's letter in her boot, and carried the whole weight of a family on shoulders that were way too small for the job. But she did it anyway. "Your papa would be proud of you too," he told her. "Prouder than any man has ever been of any daughter." Eliza smiled. It was that real smile of hers, the one that made her look like what she was. A child. Just a child. Finally, being allowed to just be one. "I know," she said. "He told me so in the letter. The one he wrote just for me. The one I have not shown to anybody." Jessie did not ask to see it. He did not need to. Some things between a father and a daughter are sacred, even when the father is gone. Especially when the father is gone. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The day opened up, all warm and green, and full of the kind of promise that only a spring in Wyoming can make. Jessie Hollowell stood on his porch with his brother's daughter holding his hand, and his cousin at his table and his house full of the sound of children. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had found the very thing he had spent 4 years pretending he did not need. This was not a second chance. Second chances are for folks who believe the first one is all over. This was something else entirely. It was something that did not even have a name. It was something that started with a blizzard and a baby who called him Papa. It started with a 9-year-old girl who slept with a knife, and a 6-year-old who drew the truth when she could not speak it. It was something that looked like 3 little girls, and sounded like laughter, and it felt like coming home after being lost for so long you forgot what home even was. Jessie squeezed Eliza's hand. She squeezed right back. And that was enough. That was more than enough. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.